All right, here we go. Revelation chapter 18. Revelation 18, and let's start with a few minutes here of discussing a little bit of what we saw in chapter 17, primarily this image of Babylon as the harlot. So tell me what you remember. What's the significance of that? Why is Babylon, the great city of Revelation 17, described as a harlot? What do you remember? Ryan, get us started here.
In part, what we have here is the juxtaposition or the comparison of the harlot to the woman, which is ultimately the bride of Christ. Harlotry is the sort of the title of those that are unfaithful to God in the marriage relationship is a betrayal of God. And it's sort of the, if not in totality, it's the representation of the beast and the Satan and the harlotries that are committed under their auspices, if you will.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So, yes, we have one of many, and at some point I'm going to have you make as long a list as possible. I said that on Sunday, so at some point that'll be an activity for us. All the pairs in Revelation of this versus this, kind of the two sides of the conflict here. And one of those is the great harlot versus the bride, okay? And chapter 17 describes the harlot, as Brian mentioned, unfaithfulness, obviously the unfaithful woman compared to the faithful woman. But let's talk. I'm not going to get it. We did this on Sunday, so we're not going to reiterate everything. But in what way? I say that she's practicing, or the great city is practicing harlotries. Okay, what does that mean? What did we see in chapter 17 the great city is doing that is like a harlot? Albert?
And it's all, they're doing it for their own selfish gain, but yet they're satisfying your eyes, your physical needs, and it's all not for your benefit, it's for their benefit.
Okay, thank you, Albert. So like a harlot, and remember, this is more like a courtesan than, a sex slave that most prostitutes are in our world, but this is someone who, by her own choice, right, seduces and attracts these lovers, right, of the nations of the world. That's what Babylon, the great city, does. And in exchange, she is built up with wealth and with status, right, and with power. And what she's offering seems attractive. I guess it is attractive. But really, in the end, you talk about drinking the cup of her impurities. There's a sense of being a slave to her once you have paid the price. And all of that. So the imagery of harlot here is intentional to paint a picture of what the city of Babylon does. And what we said in chapter 17 and what we will say again in chapter 18 as we continue to talk about Babylon is that the city of Rome is clearly in view for the original readers of Revelation. But the reason I believe that it doesn't say I'm talking about Rome and instead it talks about, I'm talking about Babylon, is because we're intended to think in terms of a type, in terms of a type of city that is as old as Babylon back in Genesis chapter 11, and that continues even to our day. The city of man that exalts itself in opposition, really, to the city of God and to God himself. Okay, and among other descriptions in the book of Revelation, that city is described as a harlot in 17, and that imagery continues, I believe, into 18. So let's read Revelation 18, as that is the backdrop. And this is a more detailed judgment. And this is very much, as we will see, in the line of the oracles from the prophets from those chapters that we studied in Ezekiel or Jeremiah or Isaiah that we sometimes consider flyover chapters, because it'll say an oracle concerning Tyre, and you kind of just read with eyes glazed over for 50 verses until you get back to talking about Israel and Judah. Well, this chapter here in Revelation 18 sounds a lot like some of those chapters in which Babylon is judged or Tyre is judged. And so as we read it, think, what is Babylon, the great city? What is Babylon being judged for according to this oracle given by God in Revelation 18? Let's read it together. Revelation 18, verse 1. After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back, as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed. As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment, since in her heart she says, I sit as queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for mighty is the Lord God who has judged her. And the kings of the earth, who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her, will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore, cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and slaves, that is, human souls. The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas for the great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. And all shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all those who trade on the sea stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads, and they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone, like a great millstone, and threw it into the sea, saying, So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence, will be found no more, and the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more, and the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more, and the light of the lamp will shine in you no more. The voice of the bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more, for your merchants were the great ones of the earth. Your nations, all nations were deceived by your sorcery, and in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and all who have been slain on the earth. Okay, you tell me, how would you answer this question? What are the sins for which Babylon is being judged here in Revelation 18? Rebellious lifestyle, Jordan says. Thank you. What else would you say? Acts of immorality? Slaying of the chosen or of the saints? Okay. Profit off of, basically business, but glory not being given to God, is what Albert says. Thank you. Other thoughts you had on the sins of this great city? Sexual immorality is mentioned more than once. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the language of demons is used, right? That can't be good. And we'll talk about it a little bit. Other thoughts on the sins? So we've had violence against God's people. We've had rebelliousness, profiting and not giving glory to God, sexual immorality. Yeah, self-glorification, right? Language like, there's no one else besides me. I'm going to be here forever, that kind of stuff. Anything else you want to say about the sins of this city before we look in a little more detail at the text here? Okay. Well, some of these I've already mentioned. I just want to briefly overview with the 4 tools that we've been using. And I've already mentioned some of these things, and you have just told me this, okay? That in terms of key points, right, Revelation can be difficult. So one of the tools that we use is just, find the big things that you can put your anchor down and say, I don't know much about what everything means, but I can at least say this with confidence. And I think you guys have told me with confidence that the city of Babylon here, symbolically Babylon, is judged for arrogance, for trusting in wealth, and for the oppression not only of God's people, but of people in general. Okay? In terms of the context, remember, as we started the discussion, we are continuing this picture of Babylon that started in chapter 17. I'm back in chapter 14, I believe, in verse 8, was the first time we heard Babylon mentioned when an angel announced the same announcement that we see here in chapter 18, fallen, fallen is Babylon. But it wasn't until chapter 17 that we started seeing a more detailed picture of the woman, the harlot, and of the city called Babylon. That has started in 17 and is continuing into 18. And so keep in your mind, even though the language of prostitution and harlotry is not used in 18, we're still talking about Babylon. And Babylon was referred to in chapter 17 as the mother of prostitutes. And so we can continue to work with that imagery to understand the picture of this city and what she's about, right? In terms of patterns of Scripture, I've mentioned this as well, but these are some, not all of them, but some specific places in the Old Testament that you could jot in your margin if they're not already there in a cross-reference, or jot down in notes that if you're wanting to know the backdrop, the judgments of the Old Testament that are being drawn on here as this version of Babylon falls under condemnation, you look at passages like Isaiah 21, Isaiah 47, Jeremiah 51. And then, as I said, even though Babylon is the name here in Revelation 18, and so looking back at the oracles of Babylon in particular in the Old Testament is going to be foundational, the judgments against Tyre, particularly in Ezekiel 27. Ezekiel 27, and again, we did this not too long ago. I think Robert actually taught for me. I was out of town. But Ezekiel 27 is... Again, it's long and hard to read, kind of, because you're like, what's the point? But it details it offers in great detail a picture of the economy of Tyre, the world economy, and tells you all the different things that they traded for from all over the world. And you're reading like 25 verses into that, and you're like, what's the point of this? Okay, but it's showing a picture very similar to what we see here in Revelation 18, which is a city that is profiting all over the world, not for the ends of God's glory, but for their own ends, their own gain and their own power and their own wealth and their own pride. Okay, so this is kind of a mix here in Revelation 18 of the prophetic oracles against Babylon and against Tyre in the Old Testament. And like I said, the original readers would have easily, I think, seen Rome's pride and their luxurious wealth in Revelation 18. But as we said before, this is not just about Rome. This is about the spirit of Babylon that continues to pervade the city of man and even the cities and the nations of man today, including our own nation. And we should be thinking in those terms and hopefully get a chance to talk some about our own situation before we're through tonight. Okay? Let's go. I'm gonna break this up into 3 sections here: 1 to 8 in the voices that are calling from heaven, and then 9 to 20 and some voices that are coming from the earth, and then 21 to 24 and the last word of the angel in this chapter. So chapters 1 to 8. Brian mentioned this before, but in verse 2, the great pronouncement is made. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. And it says she's become a dwelling place for demons, unclean spirits, unclean birds, detestable beasts. The picture is in some ways of a haunted city, if you'll allow me to use that. I mean, it says a haunt, okay? There's a very similar picture in Isaiah 34, actually describing the city of Jerusalem, looking forward to after Jerusalem will be destroyed. And it's a picture of basically, all the human activity and the human dwelling that you think of in a city, all that's gone. And it's like this abandoned city. You see the tumbleweeds blowing across the road. But more than that, you see that animals have kind of made their way to take up residence within the city. And in Isaiah 34, in your English Bible, you won't necessarily see it. But in the Greek translation of Isaiah 34, it talks about demons being among those that re-inhabit the city. Okay? And that was a very common thing. In the ancient world, the wilderness was seen as the place where danger lurks. Okay? And so you build cities to be safe from the danger. And when you're traveling, you're trying to get through the wide open spaces as quick as you can, because that's where the danger is, to get to the safety of civilization, the safety of the city. But in this case, that civilization has been overtaken again by the chaos of nature, and animals and unclean spirits have taken over as this city that was once great has crumbled back into chaos. That's the picture of this kind of desolated city as the chapter opens up. And she is, again, condemned in verse 3 for spreading her immorality, the harlot of chapter 17, spreading her immorality, making other nations to participate in her sins. So keep that in mind as you go through. In Revelation 18, obviously there are lots of sins to pin on this woman, okay, and on this city. Okay, the sexual immorality that she commits, the trust in her own wealth, and the piling up and the amassing of luxurious wealth and abundance for her own pride. Okay, those are all sins that she's guilty of, but she's a harlot, so she's also involved in making other people, the rest of the nations, other nations that she interacts with, to participate in the same sins, whether immorality or of arrogance or of indulgence of luxury for prideful purposes. Okay, so she's spreading her sins to the world with her influence. And speaking of influence, verse 4 is a call on the people, taken right out of Jeremiah 51, to come out of Babylon, to come out of her, and because there is this danger of taking part in her sins. And so come out of her, lest you take part in her sins and then share in her judgment. So keep that in mind also as we go through how it is that God's people are called to come out of Babylon. And then you see here in 5 to 8 what we've also seen before, okay, that it is her arrogance, verse 7, I sit as queen, I am no widow, mourning I shall never see. In terms of the Bible, that is a clear-cut reason for God to chop somebody down, right? That kind of arrogance. No one can do anything to me, right? I'm undefeated. I'm undefeatable, right? Indivisible. And nothing can ever bring me down. And so for this reason, verse 8, in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and burned up with fire, because God will have judges. So as Brian asked the question before, right? Who's bringing down the great city? Well, ultimately God is, but she's also doing it to herself, okay? Because of her rebellion and because of her pride. Okay, that's right. And it's a self-destructing enterprise, the city of Babylon. Okay, And this phrase is repeated over and over again in the chapter. Hopefully you caught that as we read and you picked up on that reiteration. It either says in verse 8, it says in a single day, but then in the rest of the chapter, I believe it says in a single hour, this will happen. And so I put a reference here to Daniel 5 and verse 30. Okay, if you remember what happened in Daniel 5, this was King Belshazzar, okay, the son, really the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And he was partying in Daniel 5. And why was he partying, or what was going on while he was partying? Yeah, the city was under siege and the enemy was at the gates, okay? And verse 30 says, that same night, after all the great, accomplishments and this great city that Nebuchadnezzar had built, Babylon the Great, which I have built, for the world power it became, okay? The text says, and that same night, it was gone. In a single day, in a single hour, the great empire, the great city of man that everybody marveled at, wonder of the world, it's gone. Okay? And as we said in that story, goes out with just one more rebellious display of arrogance and of indulgence and of stupidity, if you allow me to use that word. Okay? So this is the voice from heaven calling out. Judgment coming on Babylon for her sins, and a call for the people of God to come out of her, lest they participate in her sins and share in the judgment. Comments or questions through verse 8 of Revelation 18? Brian?
One, we know from Jesus that we have one of two fathers, whether they like it or not. We're the sons of God, or we're the sons of Satan. And in the same vein, we know that in the gospel accounts and in Acts also, you see demon possession. And the unclean spirit entering in and cleans house, and they have nothing to fill it with God, and so the spirit comes back. You see this, and demons don't walk around in disembodied spirits and have an effect. Do you see that? I know this is a weird question, but do you see that continuing here?
In some ways, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, one of the things that Revelation is doing is pulling back the curtain to see there's more going on than meets the eye. And one of those things is the spiritual forces of light and of darkness at work. And the things that we can see with our eyes are oftentimes simply the playing out of the spiritual conflict that's taking place, okay? And so we're naive if we're saying that, demons or Satan himself, right, or his forces have no interaction in what's going on in our world. The same way we would be naive to say that angels and God and his forces are not at work, right? Now, how exactly that happens, I don't know. It is interesting, and I say this now and didn't know exactly when I was going to throw it in this class, but that picture in verse 2, okay, of a haunted, abandoned city, it's kind of interesting because you can go to Rome today. Did you know that? I mean, if we're kind of first talking about Rome and then everything else kind of falls, from that, all the other cities of man, Rome never became like an abandoned city that was just, you had ostriches walking around. That's from Isaiah 34, okay? So again, these are not literal descriptions of their complete and utter desolation to where no one ever lives there again. But there is a judgment that comes on cities like Rome that they kind of hollow out in a sense, right? And they lose their grandeur. And maybe all that to say, get back to your point, maybe in a sense they have then become so overrun by the darkness of evil that they're kind of just zombie-like, corpses of a city that are, just doing the work of the evil one. And not the great power that they were, before. I don't know. These are the ramblings of a strange mind here. So let's, well, at least we can be strange together at least. Don't quote me on any of that. But there we are, recorded for all of the world to hear and to see later on. Other questions or comments through verse 8? Okay. What you have in 9 to 20, again, you have several voices crying out, and these are earthly voices. And first, you have the kings of the earth in verse 9. And these are kings that, again, going back to the imagery from start in chapter 17, they have lain with the harlot. They have committed sexual immorality, lived in luxury with her. They've benefited from Babylon the Great. And so not only are they stunned to see the great city become what it has become, desolate and destroyed, but they are also fearful in verse 10. And they stand afar off, okay? Everybody wants to, be with the woman when she's at the height of her power and the height of her status. But once she's judged and revealed for who she is, then everybody wants to keep their distance, okay? And they're fearful that if it happened to that great city or to that great nation, it could happen to me as well, okay? And so they cry out, "You great city, you mighty city Babylon, in a single hour your judgment has come." And then in verse 11, we start to hear from the merchants, those business people, right, that have benefited from the trade and from the great prosperity of Babylon, and particularly the luxury. That list in verse 12 and 13, not as long as the one given for Tyre back in the book of Ezekiel, but 2 verses of just listing of all of these things. Maybe you picked up on this, or you would notice that all of those things in 12 and 13, those are items of luxury. Those are luxury goods, okay? For the most part. Maybe some of those you could quibble on. But I think even in verse 14, when it says your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, okay? This goes beyond just kind of the normal trade for the sustenance of life. This is the heaping up and the piling up of all the most expensive and all the most luxurious goods from all over the world, okay? And you can find, actually, in the archives, you can find lists by Roman officials of exports, or is it imports? Imports, things that are brought into Rome, okay? And those lists look very similar to the list given here in Revelation 18. This was a picture, I guess this would be easily identifiable, all the wealth that was brought in. And when you look historically, another thing that is very common as these things came in from the far reaches of Asia and from Africa, okay, into the Roman Empire, into the city of Rome herself, is that oftentimes, and you know this to be true if you know much about world history, that these luxuries were often gained by oppression or gained on the backs of slave labor, which is mentioned in particular, or gained and amassed wealth in Rome, right, like wheat pouring into Rome, and the masses in Rome were all fed with wheat as much as they wanted, while the people actually living in the countries where that wheat was harvested starved, okay? And so you have this picture of, again, lavish wealth, and I think by implication, the oppression that is done in order to bring all of this wealth into the city. And the climax of that, the culmination of that, of course, is the slavery mentioned in verse 13. And in the ancient world, the whole economic system took place on the backs of slaves. And the system of slavery and exploitation made this all possible. And you may remember even some more details about slavery in Rome, like the fact that some of them were put into arenas and murdered by wild animals, put before wild animals, or put in display in the gladiator games, simply for the entertainment of the lusting masses. Okay, so this is a picture of, again, not just the wealth, okay? Because keep this in mind too. One of the other contrasts that we'll see is it's not just the harlot of Babylon versus the bride, but if you remember from chapter 21, the bride that's described coming out of heaven is also called what? What is coming out of heaven? It's a city. And so you also have a tale of 2 cities here. You have the city of Babylon and the city of the New Jerusalem. Well, you read the description of the city of the New Jerusalem, and there's a lot of wealth. There's a lot of, precious stones, and there's a lot of beautiful things there, okay? But the purpose of that and the means of that is all just obviously so different. And so here in Revelation 18, it's not simply the wealth that is the problem, okay? But I don't know, maybe you can tell me better, but it's the heaping up of it. It's the heaping up of it for selfish gain. And ultimately, it's the oppression by which it's done, the selfishness for which it is accumulated, and ultimately the not giving of glory to God, okay? And the glory being for the city itself, for the nation itself, and not for the Lord, which is in stark contrast to the beautifully adorned bride of Christ, the city of Jerusalem. Okay? Along those lines, to that point in verse 14, the lament is, you have longed for these things. This is a picture of what we're seeing. The city, she longs for these luxuries. That is her heart's desire. Not God, okay? Not the things of God. Her heart's desire is for stuff, okay? And for the luxuries that the world can offer to her. And so these merchants who participated in this and who profited greatly from her own profit, they themselves fear their torment. So it's not just the kings, but also the merchants are afraid for their participation with the city of Babylon. Okay? Verse 17, the second part of that talks about the seafaring men who cry out. What city was like this great city? Again, the total and sudden reversal. In a single hour, we have an incomparable city become nothing. That's the judgment of God. Okay, the first will be last, so to speak. And then in verse 20, there's this interesting line here where it says that heaven and the people of heaven, of the heavenly city, should rejoice because God has given judgment for you against her. There's different ways that we could read this. But one possibility, God has given judgment for you against her, that the very kind of accusations and condemnations and judgments that the Roman Empire was starting to pass against Christians, okay, now all of that judgment is coming upon Rome herself and on the city of Rome herself. And so God is vindicating his people and placing their judgment and their condemnation where it rightfully belongs, which is on the city of Rome. Okay? Questions or comments through verse 20? Yeah, Jordan.
To me, it seems even possibly more disturbing is these cries out from the people. So some of those references you mentioned in the Old Testament, even though they weren't God's people, it seemed to be there was some level of regret or, and you kind of alluded to it in verse 14, about how do we get in this situation. But here, it seems like there is not regret. The regret is, I wish the city was still
That's right.
like it once was, because it was so fantastic across the board. Verse 9, 11, 14, and whatnot. So, maybe that's should be even more concerning to us in that sense too. Are we longing for that type of atmosphere, even though it's already, even though the judgment's already been declared?
Sure. And as things happen. I mean, you read stuff in here, Revelation 18, and again, as we've said all along, these are not predictions of stock market crashes or anything like that. Okay, but it paints a picture of what happens when the wealth of man, as we all know, falls out in a single hour, like it is prone to do, right? What happens when the bottom falls out? And where are we, to Jordan's point? Are we lamenting because, there goes all of my wealth that I've piled up for myself? Or is our lament more so what the lament of the people of God should be? Okay, hurting maybe for those who are hurting, but ultimately longing to see the city of God in all of her fullness and beauty. Albert?
Take it to application for us today, but it's just
go for it.
So much of where our treasures are laid up and where our focus is. These things, I'll speak on my behalf, I get caught up. I do seek after purple and fine linen in today's sense. And you see, God said he will judge. We are to leave it to him. And he judges, and within an hour, not literally, but it's just an example to me that it's quick. God said he would. He's going to. It's going to happen. So it's just important for me. Where's my focus? What am I focused on? What are my priorities? And whether where my treasures are laid up, and also the seafarers, the ships, never imagined that Babylon would fall and made no preparation, and they never expected spices not to be available from India, and so it just a naivety that it could be taken away in an instant. It's going to last forever, and that's prevalent within me. I don't want to speak on behalf of others, but there is that propensity to have that mindset.
Yeah, I'll join you for sure, Albert. And again, it reminds us of the kind of snuck-in warning of Revelation 16 and verse 15. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake. Keep your eyes open, keeping his garments on that he might not go about naked and be seen exposed. Okay? All right, and then this final section here in 21 to 24, another angelic pronouncement. An angel comes back on the scene and throws a millstone into the water. Okay, Jeremiah did a very similar thing. he threw a stone into the water at God's command and said, see that stone? That's Babylon, okay? That's sinking to the bottom. That's Babylon's fall. But also maybe, I should have asked you, then you could have got, gold star opportunities. But maybe the millstone also reminded you of Jesus' judgment, his condemnation of those who cause little ones to stumble. How it's better for them to have a millstone around their neck, hung around their neck and thrown into the sea. And that to me I think is significant because, again, so much of what Babylon is condemned for is what she does to others, right? Her influence on other people, dragging other people into her sins, into her immoralities, into her arrogance, into her kind of luxurious abundance, right? And the worship of stuff, okay? And so that seems fitting, right? The hurting, the abuse of the innocent and of the vulnerable here in chapter 18, and the influencing of others to sin seems to fit with Mark 9 and those who cause little ones to stumble, okay? But we return in verses 21 and 23 to the picture of the haunted city. If you can imagine walking through a great city like the city of Babylon or like the city of Rome or any great city, but it's completely quiet, okay? Nothing going on. No work being done, no celebrations, no songs, no sounds of the mill, nothing going on. No light, dark, quiet, desolate. This is back to that picture of the haunt from the beginning of the chapter. Again, not a literal description of the judgment that will come on these cities, although a city like Rome, actually, from John's day, which was the city of Rome be about 1 million people, and then within a couple hundred years it's down to, tens of thousands. Okay, so there's a something happens to Rome, and it does fall in measurable senses over the next few centuries. But it's more than that in Revelation 18. It's the judgment of God being carried out as one nation gives way to another nation, as one city gives way to another city, and every city rises up thinking that it's the next great thing, only to be humbled, only to be brought low in the cycle of human history. Okay, and again, another summary of their sins in verses 23 and 24. Why is it desolate? Why is it so quiet? Verse 23 and 24, because the merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery, and in you was found the blood of prophets and saints, and all those who were slain on the earth. Okay, so let me ask you this. We've kind of started in this direction. We have about 7 minutes or so to discuss this. We are clearly commanded in this chapter, Revelation 18 and verse 4, to come out of her, to come out of Babylon, lest you take part in her sins. So my question to you is, what does that look like? What does it mean to obey this command, to come out of Babylon? What do you think? Brian, get us started here.
We're a holy people, a sanctified people, set apart for a holy purpose. So separate yourself from the evil is the way I interpret it.
Okay. Separate yourself from the evil? What else would you say?
It seems like this is so encompassing. Maybe it would be hard to live in that city and be, as Brian said, set apart, I wonder. So to me, it almost has a feeling almost like Sodom and Gomorrah to a certain degree. And so I don't know what the application is, but maybe just have a sober mind of where we live, what we do, how we behave, who we associate with, and flee from the city, I guess, maybe.
What do you mean?
Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate. So, come out. Is he telling us? Could it be a commandment or a suggestion? I don't take it as a suggestion. It's.
I don't think it's a suggestion. It's a commandment for sure. The question is, how is it obeyed, right? Because even in the context of Jeremiah, right? I guess I'm kind of don't want to answer too much for you. In fact, I'm not. I'm going to stop talking. Ian, what do you think? unless you had more to say, Albert. On it.
Fundamentally, it means follow God. But I think if you take it a step further, recognizing that we live in God's world, right? This isn't man's world. So you can't separate yourself from the world physically. We're here. We can't be anywhere else until we leave this world. And I think you need to fundamentally understand that this is God's world and that He has ownership over everyone and everything here. And because of that, because He is our Father, we respect His rule, His command, His, the fundamental laws and the commandments that He's put in place for us to follow. So it's a switch in focus. Don't focus on what this world is saying and doing and leading you to believe, but focus on what God is saying and doing and leading you to believe.
Thank you. Rick, let's get Rick and then get back to Brian here.
You may not want to go in this direction, but I'm thinking back to the 7 churches.
Your class, Rick.
Yeah, right. It's obvious that some of the churches had been infected by Babylon, and they were tolerating sin, and it talks about those within the church that had not yet soiled their garments and withholding themselves. And so this may be on a city-nation level come out of Babylon, but those 7 churches also had issues that at some point the faithful Christians may had to come out of those churches to hold themselves pure. It's just a thought that crossed my mind because it's obvious those churches, some of them at least, had been infected.
Sure. Well, the one church that has Jezebel right there, and in fact, the queen of Revelation 17:18 may very well be a reference to Jezebel, the queen, wife of Ahab, and she's named symbolically in one of the churches as the one committing immorality with others, right? Right?
Well, the way I would answer this is going back to the prayer of Jesus in John 17. He's talking to saved, the children, that they're in the world, but they're not of the world. Our citizenship is in heaven because we belong to the kingdom of Christ. Therefore, you separate yourself from the activity, and the world is the world of darkness. That's what He has transferred from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of His beloved Son. It's keeping ourselves separate from sin and separate from sinners, and not engaging in their activities. Because if I'm not mistaken, Babylon ultimately is the metaphor for the entire world.
Yeah, the city of man. And I think these comments are revealing to us that for the most part, right, we're stuck here. Okay, you're in the city of Babylon, like the exiles in Jeremiah's day or Daniel's day, and yet there's this call to come out of her. Now, I think Jordan's comment is worth considering, that we need to look, each of us individually, at our own lives, our own circumstances, our own relationships. And if there's radical change that needs to be made to get out of something, we can't just stay in a situation that's harming us spiritually and say, well, I'm stuck here. I got to be in the world, not of the world. So I'm going to continue in these unhealthy relationships in an environment that's not good for me or my family. We have to take that seriously. But I think we're called to be something like what Daniel and his friends were in Babylon. To not be of Babylon, even if we are walking the streets of Babylon, so to speak. And I think Revelation 18 provides us some difficult things to think about in that regard, because the focus of Revelation 18 is so much on the heaping up of stuff and of money for our own wealth and our own pride. I mean, excuse me for saying so, but that's the American dream, isn't it? That the spirit of Babylon is just so interwoven into who we are as Americans. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, okay? We're all pursuing the life that we want for ourselves, which involves stuff and money and more of it, okay? And enjoying it for myself, okay? And finding ways to live lives that look so radically different from that it's noticeable, okay? Not compromising in the least, but living lives that are for the glory of God and for the service of other people, even as God is blessing, as He has blessed most all of us in here, with money and with stuff and with homes. We should be thankful for that. But seeking to be in the church the anti-Babylon, that is not just heaping up all of these resources and things for our own enjoyment and for our own pleasure, but using them as what they are, gifts from God that are then put to His service, to be a blessing in the world, to serve other people, to love other people, and to be lights in our communities. Okay, to maybe we live among Babylon, and Jeremiah even said to the exiles, "Seek the welfare of Babylon." You're living there, okay? So you be good citizens and you do what you can, but you never become of Babylon, and you never become seduced by her ways or compromising to her values, and instead you continue to live as the city of God, as the people of God, even in her midst. Okay? All right, so that was Revelation 18. We'll move on to chapter 19 on Sunday and encourage you to read it beforehand. Thank you, guys.